Arthur Vance did not believe in ghosts. As a structural engineer, he believed in load-bearing walls, concrete foundations, and the unyielding laws of physics. But as he stood before the rusted iron gates of Blackwood Manor, holding a yellowed letter that smelled of damp earth and old lavender, his rational mind felt a sudden, cold chill. The letter had arrived on a Tuesday. It bore no return address, only a messy postmark from a small coastal town called Oakhaven. Inside was a single sheet of heavy parchment, written in a shaky, elegant cursive. Arthur, your uncle Jonathan Blackwood has passed. The estate is yours, but the house does not want an owner. It wants a witness. Come before the next new moon, or the things buried beneath the floorboards will find another voice. E. Thorne. Eternate Law. Arthur had not seen his Uncle Jonathan in 15 years. The old man had been a reclusive painter, famous for his dark, unsettling landscapes that seemed to pulse with a strange internal light. When Arthur's mother spoke of him, her voice always dropped to a whisper, as if the mere mention of his name might summon him into the room. Now Arthur was here. His rented sedan idled on the overgrown gravel drive, the engine ticking as it cooled in the damp autumn air. The manor loomed before him like a skeletal beast rising from the fog. Its slate roof was fractured. Ivy choked the stone pillars of the veranda, and the tall, arched windows stared out like blind eyes. He stepped out of the car. The gravel crunched under his boots, a harsh, loud sound that felt almost sacrilegious in the heavy silence of the woods. The trees here didn't sway. They seemed to lean inward, their bare branches forming a jagged cage against the pale gray sky. He walked up the stone steps. The front door, made of dark, heavy oak with a rusted iron knocker shaped like a raven's head, stood slightly ajar. It hadn't been forced. It had simply waited. The threshold. Arthur pushed the door. It swung inward with a long, agonizing groan that vibrated through the floorboards of the foyer. A gust of air rushed past him, not the fresh breeze of the autumn woods, but an indoor draft that smelled of old paper, sealing wax, and something faintly metallic, like copper or fresh blood. He clicked on his heavy-duty flashlight. The beam cut through the swirling dust motes, illuminating a vast, cavernous hall. A grand staircase swept upward into the gloom of the second floor, its mahogany banister polished smooth by decades of unseen hands. Portraits lined the walls, their faces obscured by deep shadows and thick layers of grime. "Hello!" Arthur called out. His voice was swallowed instantly by the high ceiling. No echo returned. The house absorbed sound, locking it away in its wooden bones. He stepped inside and closed the door behind him. It clicked shut with a definitive weight, isolating him from the world outside. To his left lay the drawing room. He swept his flashlight across the space. Velvet curtains, faded to the color of dried bruises, covered the tall windows. A grand piano sat in the corner, its keys exposed, gleaming with a fine coat of dust. Strangely, one middle C key was depressed, held down by a small black stone. Arthur walked over to the piano. He didn't touch the stone. Instead, he looked at the wall above the instrument. Hanging there was a painting, one of his uncle's works. It was large, framed in tarnished gold. The canvas depicted the very room he was standing in, but with a horrifying difference. In the painting, a pale, elongated figure stood right behind the grand piano, its long fingers resting on the keys. Arthur turned around sharply, shining his light into the empty corner behind him. Nothing was there, just the quiet dust and the cold air. The study. He needed to find the lawyer, or at least some paperwork that explained what he had inherited. The letter mentioned an attorney named E. Thorne. Maybe there was a study, a place where Jonathan kept his records. Arthur moved down the long corridor, his boots echoing softly now that his ears had adjusted to the acoustic weight of the house. Doors flanked the hallway, most of them closed. He tried the brass handle of the third door on the right. It turned, and the door gave way. The study was surprisingly orderly compared to the decaying foyer. A large oak desk sat in the center of the room, facing a massive stone fireplace. Shelves packed with leather-bound books lined the walls from floor to ceiling. On the desk lay an open ledger, a brass inkstand with a dried quill, and an oil lamp that still held fuel. Arthur approached the desk and looked down at the ledger. The handwriting was his uncle's, spidery and erratic. October 14th, the last entry read, "The walls are breathing again. The mortar between the stones isn't lime. It is bone dust. It remembers the fire of '84. It whispers names I haven't heard since I was a child. Arthur is coming. I saw him in the grain of the wood yesterday. He brings his hammers and his levels, thinking he can measure a nightmare." Arthur's hand trembled slightly as he set the flashlight down on the desk. He felt a prickle of sweat at the back of his neck. His uncle had clearly lost his mind in his final years. Solitude and madness were old companions in houses like this. He reached out to turn the page of the ledger, but his fingers brushed against a cold, smooth object hidden beneath a stack of loose sketches. He pulled it away. It was a heavy silver pocket watch. It wasn't ticking. The hands were frozen precisely at 3:17. Suddenly, a loud, sharp thud echoed from the floor above him, directly overhead. It sounded like a heavy trunk being dragged across the bare floorboards. Screech, thump. Arthur froze. He looked up at the ceiling, where a faint stain of dark water marred the plaster. "The house is empty," he whispered to himself. Though the sound of his own voice did little to steady his racing pulse, he grabbed his flashlight, left the study, and strode back toward the grand staircase. The second floor was waiting. The upper gallery. The stairs creaked under his weight, not the normal settling of an old house, but a sharp warning chatter, like teeth biting down in the cold. When he reached the upper landing, the darkness seemed thicker, almost tangible, pressing against the beam of his flashlight like black oil. A long hallway stretched before him, lined with doors that looked identical to one another. The air here was colder, biting at his cheeks. Thump! The sound came again, louder this time, from the far end of the corridor, near the studio at the very back of the house. Arthur walked toward it, his boots moving in a steady rhythm. As he passed the second door on the left, the door drifted open on its own by a few inches. A faint sliver of yellow light cut across the hallway floor. He stopped. He hadn't seen any electricity working. Downstairs, the fuse box by the front door had been choked with cobwebs, and the main switch was thrown down. Yet, light was coming from inside this room. He pushed the door open wider. The room was a bedroom, small and sparsely furnished. An iron bedstead stood against the wall, draped in a white quilt that was yellowed with age. Sitting in a wooden rocking chair beside the unlit hearth was a woman. She wore a high-collared Victorian dress of dark gray silk. Her back was to him, her silver hair pinned up in a neat, severe bun. She was rocking gently back and forth. Creak, 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 the sound keeping time with a clock that wasn't there. "Ma'am?" Arthur said, his throat tight. "You shouldn't be in this house. It's not safe." The rocking stopped. The woman did not turn around immediately. When she finally did, her movement was stiff, mechanical, like a doll operated by rusted springs. Her face was pale, lined with deep exchia, ancient wrinkles, but her eyes were startlingly clear, a bright, piercing blue that seemed to look right through Arthur's skin and bone. "Arthur," she said. Her voice sounded like dry leaves sliding across a tombstone. "You're late." Jonathan finished the last portrait an hour before he died. He'd saved the eyes for you. Before Arthur could speak, before he could run or ask who she was, the candle on the bedside table flickered out. Total, absolute darkness slammed down on the room, thick and suffocating, and in the dark, right beside his ear, he heard a wet, rattling breath whisper, "Welcome home." The vanishing room. Arthur stumbled backward out of the room, his boots skidding on the polished floor of the hallway. He hit the opposite wall hard, the breath knocking out of his lungs. With trembling fingers, he slapped the side of his heavy flashlight. The beam flickered twice and then cut through the darkness with a sharp, white glare. Suddenly, a cold drop of liquid fell from above, landing directly on Arthur's hand. He looked down. It wasn't water. It was wet, black oil paint. He slowly tilted his flashlight upward toward the massive glass skylight. Hanging from the iron rafters, just inches below the glass, was a figure. It was wrapped in a rotting gray silk dress, its long silver hair hanging down like tattered cords. It was staring down at him with wide, empty eyes, and from its fingertips, wet black paint was dripping slowly onto the floor below. The unseen attorney. Arthur let out a ragged cry and turned to run, dropping his flashlight in the panic. The heavy metal light rolled across the floorboards, its beams spinning wildly, illuminating shifting silhouettes of the covered easels. They looked like they were moving, stepping out from the walls to block his exit. He scrambled for the door, his hands slipping on the smooth brass knob. He threw his weight against it, burst out into the hallway, and ran blindly toward the grand staircase. As he reached the landing, he saw a light downstairs in the foyer, a warm, flickering amber glow that hadn't been there before. He didn't care what it was. He just needed to escape the suffocating darkness of the upper floor. He bounded down the stairs 3 at a time, his boots thudding heavily against the wood. Standing in the center of the entrance hall was a man. He was dressed in a sharp, 3-piece tweed suit that looked entirely out of place in the decaying mansion. He held a brass hurricane lamp in one hand and a leather briefcase in the other. He had a neatly trimmed gray beard and wore gold-rimmed spectacles that reflected the lamplight. "Ah, Mr. Vance," the man said, his voice calm, professional, and entirely mundane. "I see you've received my letter. I apologize for my tardiness. The roads through Oakhaven are treacherous after dark." Arthur stopped at the bottom of the stairs, gasping for breath, his hands. Who are you?" "Ephraim Thorne, your uncle's attorney," the man replied with a polite nod. "We spoke through correspondence. I assume you have encountered the unique architecture of Blackwood Manor?" "There is something in this house," Arthur gasped, pointing a shaking finger toward the upper floor. "A woman, a monster. My uncle's paintings are changing. We need to leave. Right now." Mr. Thorne didn't look surprised. He didn't look frightened. He simply sighed, a sound full of heavy, ancient weariness, and set his briefcase down on the dusty grand piano. "I am afraid leaving is no longer an option, Mr. Vance," Thorne said softly. "The new moon has begun. The house has already closed the gates." "What are you talking about?" Arthur demanded, stepping toward the attorney. "I have a car outside. I am a structural engineer, not a madman. I don't believe in whatever trick you're playing here." "Look outside the window, Arthur," Thorne said gently. Arthur strode to the tall windows of the drawing room and ripped back the faded velvet curtains. He pressed his face against the cold glass. The gravel driveway was gone. His rented sedan was gone. There were no woods, no road, no sky. Outside the window was nothing but a vast, churning ocean of absolute blackness. It wasn't night. It was a void, a dark abyss that seemed to press against the glass, making the sturdy window frames groan under an impossible pressure. "The Blackwood estate does not exist in your world anymore," Thorne explained, stepping into the drawing room and placing the brass lamp on a table. "Your Uncle Jonathan didn't just paint landscapes, Arthur. He painted doorways. Every canvas he created was a splinter of his own soul, used to patch the holes between our reality and the things that wait in the dark." "This is insane," Arthur whispered, backing away from the window. "Jonathan held the line for 40 years, Thorne continued, opening his briefcase and pulling out a thick document bound in dark leather. "He painted the horrors so they would remain trapped inside the frames. But a painter needs a muse and a house needs an anchor. When he died, the contract broke. The things he drew are coming back to reclaim their canvas." Thorne laid the document on the piano, right next to the depressed middle C key. "This is your inheritance, Arthur. Not the stone, not the land, but the duty. You must sign the registry of the house accepting the mantle of the witness. If you do, the doors will open and you may leave for now. If you do not." Before Thorne could finish, the floorboards beneath their feet began to vibrate. A low, rhythmic thumping sound echoed from the basement below like a massive, wet heart beating deep within the foundations of the house. Thump, thump, thump. The plaster on the walls began to crack, and from the fissures a thick, black ink-like liquid began to ooze, spelling out a single word over and over again on the wallpaper. Witness. 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 You must choose, Arthur, Thorne said, his voice losing its human warmth, sounding more and more like the rattling leaves from the bedroom upstairs. The house is hungry and the ink is running dry. The black fluid oozing from the walls smelled strongly of iron and stagnant water. Arthur backed away from the piano, his eyes darting between the document and Ephraim Thorne. The attorney stood perfectly still, but the light from his hurricane lamp cast a shadow behind him that didn't match his movements. The shadow's arms were elongated, stretching up the wall and clawing at the ceiling plaster. "You're not Thorne," Arthur said, his voice dropping to a whisper as a horrific realization washed over him. "I looked at the dates in my uncle's ledger. The fire of Basse. Ephraim Thorne was the attorney who died in that fire trying to save Jonathan's first collection." The man in the tweed suit smiled. The skin around his mouth didn't wrinkle naturally. It stretched like old rubber. "A name is just a garment. Mr. Vance, we wear what makes our guests feel comfortable. But you are a man of structure. You see the framework of the lie." The lamp on the table flickered violently. The amber glow shifted to a sickening pale silver, the exact color of the glowing ink in the studio portrait. "The contract needs a signature," the entity using Thorne's voice hissed. Jonathan's fingers became too stiff to hold the brush. "The house is decaying because it lacks an artist to maintain the walls. You share his blood. Your hands are steady. Your mind understands lines and boundaries." "I am an engineer," Arthur shouted, his anger finally overtaking his fear. "I build things to last in the real world. I don't paint nightmares." "You will," the voice echoed from every corner of the room. "Or you will become the canvas." The basement flights. With a sudden burst of adrenaline, Arthur didn't run for the stairs or the front door. Instead, he lunged across the room, grabbed the heavy brass hurricane lamp, and hurled it directly at the entity. The glass shattered against the creature's chest. The silver fuel spilled across its tweed suit, igniting instantly not into hot orange flames, but into a freezing, white-hot fire that hissed like a nest of disturbed vipers. The entity let out a high-pitched, screeching roar that shattered the window panes of the drawing room. Arthur didn't wait to see more. He turned and ran through the dining hall toward the kitchen. Remembering the structural layout common to these late 19th century manors, near the pantry, he found what he was looking for: a heavy, iron-reinforced wooden door leading down into the foundations. He threw the bolt open, plunged into the darkness of the basement, and slammed the door shut behind him, locking it from the inside. He was in complete darkness now. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. The screen was cracked, but it still lit up, showing 0% cellular signal and the time, 3:16 a.m., 1 minute before the time frozen on his uncle's pocket watch. Using the faint glow of the phone screen, Arthur descended the cold stone steps. The air down here was thick, heavy, and wet. The walls weren't made of finished timber or neat brick. They were raw, jagged stones held together by a dark/coarse mortar that felt strangely rough, almost like crushed bone, just as the ledger had said. As he reached the dirt floor of the cellar, the rhythmic thumping returned, so loud now that it vibrated through the soles of his boots. Thump, thump, thump. He followed the sound, driven by a desperate need to find the source, to find a structural weakness in this nightmare. He passed through rows of empty wine racks and forgotten crates until he reached the very center of the foundation, directly beneath the main foyer. There sat the haunt of Blackwood Manor, the foundation of bones. In the center of the cellar floor was a massive, circular pit. Inside it lay a giant, pulsating mass of wet, black canvas and old frames, twisted together like the roots of an ancient, dying tree. It looked like thousands of forgotten paintings had been melted down into a singular, living organism. Every time it throbbed, a wave of cold energy rippled through the stone floor. Sticking out of this dark mass were hundreds of paintbrushes, their handles made of polished bone, their bristles made of human hair. And sitting on the edge of the pit, looking incredibly small and frail, was the body of Uncle Jonathan. He had been dead for days, his skin pale and translucent, but his right hand was still tightly clamped around a massive silver paintbrush. His fingers had literally grown into the wooden handle, fused together by thick strands of black ink. "He didn't die of old age," Arthur whispered, tears pricking his eyes. He was consumed. A soft rustling sound came from behind him. Arthur turned his phone light toward the stairs. The entity, its tweed suit charred and smoking with white frost, was descending the steps. Beside it walked the woman in the gray silk dress, her head tilting at an unnatural angle. Behind them, dozens of figures from Jonathan's paintings, the elongated man from the piano, the faceless silhouettes from the studio, were crawling down the stone walls like spiders. "The time has come, Arthur," the entity said, its voice now entirely devoid of human pretense, sounding like a chorus of screaming voices. "The clock strikes 3:17. Sign or join the Foundation." Arthur looked at his phone. The digital clock shifted. 3:17 a.m. The house began to groan violently. The stone walls started to buckle inward. Above them, the ceiling of the cellar began to crack, dropping heavy clods of dirt and mortar onto the pulsating pit. Without a witness, the entire structure was collapsing into the void. Arthur looked at his uncle's corpse, then at the advancing horde of shadows. He realized there was no escaping the house. The void outside the windows meant there was no world left to run to. But as an engineer, he knew that if you can't destroy a structure, you change its load-bearing points. You rewrite the blueprints. "You want a witness?" Arthur yelled, his voice echoing over the roaring of the collapsing house. "You want someone to maintain the walls? Fine! But I choose the design." Arthur lunged forward, ignoring the screams of the shadows. He reached down and grabbed the silver paintbrush from his uncle's frozen grip. With a brutal yank, he tore it free. A sharp electric shock shot up his arm, turning his veins a deep, prominent black from his fingertips to his shoulder. The pain was blinding, but he didn't stop. He didn't sign the leather document. Instead, he drove the bone-handled brush directly into the raw dirt floor at his feet, dragging it through a puddle of the black fluid, and began to paint a massive, glowing circle around the pulsating pit. He didn't paint faces or monsters. He used his engineer's mind. He drew precise mathematical lines, perfect geometric angles, and structural arches. He painted a cage of pure logic. "I reinforce this foundation," Arthur screamed, his voice blending with the house. "By the laws of gravity, by the laws of physics, by the unyielding strength of concrete and iron I command you to hold." The shadows shrieked as the geometric lines began to glow with a brilliant, blinding white light. The black fluid inside the pit began to harden, turning from a wet, moving mass into solid, unbreakable stone. The figures crawling down the walls froze mid-motion, their dark bodies cracking like dry clay as the white light touched them. The entity using Thorn's form let out one final, agonizing wail as the geometric lines wrapped around its legs, pulling it down into the floorboards, binding it to the very structure it tried to control. The roaring stopped. The vibrations ceased. Absolute dead silence returned to Blackwood Manor. The sun rose over Oakhaven, casting a warm, golden light through the clean, unbroken glass of the grand skylight. Arthur Vance sat at the oak desk in the study. His left hand was perfectly normal, but his right arm was permanently stained with dark, intricate patterns of black ink that looked like architectural blueprints etched into his skin. He looked down at the ledger. He didn't use a pen. He simply dipped his index finger into a small well of black fluid and wrote in a neat, precise block script. October 15th. The foundations are stable. The structural integrity of the manor has been restored. The shadows have been partitioned behind the load-bearing walls. They do not whisper anymore. They support the roof. I am Arthur Vance. I am the witness. And this house will stand. He closed the ledger, stood up, and looked out the window. The gravel drive was back, The autumn woods were bright and green. The gate was open. But Arthur didn't leave. He walked upstairs to the studio, picked up a fresh T-square and a pencil, and began to draw the next room.